notice that I'm not standing next to a headstone with my name on it. You may also notice the lack of other Negroes in this cemetery. Well, in my time, that's what we were called by the nice white folks. I'm Nancy Gooch, and I was one such Negro in El Dorado County. Truth is, I'm not sure I would have been allowed to be buried here. No, not here, not this cemetery. This cemetery was founded by white powerful men. And although there is no actual proof that colored folks could not be buried here, I'm sure it would have been frowned upon. In any case, we didn't ask. No, I made my final rest near my family home in Coloma. That's where I made my home after being brought here during the gold rush. My owner, Mr. Gooch, wanted to strike it rich, so he packed up all his belongings, myself included, and headed west with so many other folks during that time. There was no time to waste. Gold had to be found before somebody else found it. The insatiable greed of some men just never made sense to me, not in my mind. Well, Peter and I made the long trek from Missouri in a wagon train in 1849 or thereabouts. Now, Peter was, for all intents and purposes, my husband and Andrew's father. However, slaves were not permitted to marry, so to the world, we were just a couple slaves. And there was a baby slave somewhere thereabouts if you looked hard enough. My son, Andrew, my only son, was just 3 years old at the time. Considered too young for the journey and too young for the gold fields, was left behind. Sold to another family at just 3 years old. They just took him away. Gave him their name, Monroe. And Peter and I put into a wagon and made to leave him behind. I thought I'd never see him again. Could you be made to leave a young child behind, knowing full well you'd never see him again? Just a baby. We arrived here not too long before California became an actual state. Now, slavery being illegal in California as a free state, our owner had little choice. We were free. And also penniless. Stipends were not given to freed slaves. We had to find work. Luckily, the miners, mostly unencumbered men who didn't care much for cooking and cleaning for themselves, would hire out the cooking, cleaning, and mending and such when they could afford it. And I took job after job. There was no shortage of men looking for and finding gold. And my Peter, he was a fair carpenter. He took jobs building much of what became a small community. A community that dwindled as fast as it grew, as folks snatched up all the gold and moved on. We worked and we saved and we worked. In about 7 years or so, Peter and I, we finally got married. A year after we got married, we purchased a large parcel of land. We worked the land and we sold fruits and vegetables, a rare commodity that commanded top dollar. And we worked. Oh, we worked. Peter died a few years later, just before word of the Emancipation Proclamation. My only goal throughout all of this was to see my son again. I couldn't go back to Missouri. Couldn't afford it. And traveling back to a state where slavery was still legal was not an option. There was a war going on where my baby was. There was nothing I could do. So I worked and I saved, all the while bending my ear to hear of any news of the war being fought over slavery in the East. When the war did end a few years later, it appeared all the Negroes were free. Even my boy Andrew, or so it seemed. Just like when Peter and I were free, all the newly freed Negroes had nothing. All the owners found themselves without free labor, and hiring workers to work those enormous tracts of land was impractical. So they divvied up the land and allowed the former slaves to rent out plots for a percentage of their crops or earnings from sales. The tenant farmers soon found themselves in debt to the landowners and trapped in a cycle of poverty. Better than being owned, but not quite as free as many had hoped. Well, Andrew, he married another freed slave, Sarah, and had 2 boys on a tenant farm, Andrew Jr. and Earle. The first 2 in our family to be born free in God knows how many generations. And me, I worked and I saved. I was all alone working and saving. Working the land, working as a domestic, working and living for about 7, 8 years. When I was about to turn 60, a full 20 years after leaving my son behind and coming to this place, I finally saved enough money to pay off Andrew's tenant farm debt and to purchase 4 railroad tickets for he, his wife, and his young sons. Months later, the moment I had dreamed about for a good third of my life, the moment that I never quite allowed myself to believe would happen, happened. My boy, my beautiful boy, a grown man now, stepped off the train and into his mother's loving embrace. I could have died right then and there, and I would have called that a happy story. Andrew Monroe. He had so much of his father in him. He was a doer. He was light and free and had big plans. No sooner did he get off that train did he start clearing the land, planting orchards, a vineyard, brought on some cattle, even a wheat field. His prowess in the field drew the attention of James Marshall. You know, the man that started it all. He was still around. Now, I'm not gonna lie. It was a good time for our family. But things weren't always so easy. Although abolitionists gravitated to California and the mining camps turned towns were just a melting pot of folks from all over the world, people didn't like to see a Negro family so prosperous. They didn't like much a Negro landowner at all. Yet, we still continue to grow and thrive with the community. Andrew, he believed highly in the power of education, teaching himself how to read and write. And he insisted that his children, my grandchildren, attend school. You know the famous poet Edwin Markham? Well, he taught some of my grandbabies, believe it or not. Now, we didn't know he was going to be a famous poet at the time. To us, he was just Mr. Markham. You know his poem, The Man with the Hoe? Well, that poem was about my Andrew. It was. And it's understandable to anyone who knew him. As I remember it, the opening goes something like this. Bowed by the weight of centuries, he leans upon his hoe and gazes on the ground. The emptiness of ages in his face, and on his back, the burden of the world. Who made him dead to rapture and despair, a thing that grieves not and that never hopes? Well, my Andrew, as he matured, he could be a quiet and still man, as anyone who knew him would attest. Some say Markham wrote that poem about some painting. I don't know. That first part sure does remind me of Andrew. Now, Sarah and Andrew, they gave me a total of 6 grandbabies. Now, they all lived on and helped work the land. Some married and some prospered in other ways. Pearlie built the blacksmith shop, and he worked that trade for a while. And Andrew had come to befriend James Marshall. And when Marshall died, he and his boy Pearlie, they trekked Marshall's body back to Coloma and buried him in Coloma, where he pulled gold from that river all those many years ago. Pearlie became caretaker of Marshall's land, and the family eventually owned that and much more of the Coloma Valley. I lived the better half of my life a free woman. But I can't help but wonder what life I would have lived if I had lived an entire life free. I died in my 90th year, surrounded by, if I do have to say so myself, prolific family. I died proud. I died knowing that I made something. I built something. Something of a life for myself and for my family. I died free.